everyone, and welcome to World Aquatic Animal Day 2023, Alternatives to the Use of Aquatic Animals. I'm Amy Wilson. I am the co-founder and director of Animal Law Reform South Africa, and I'm the originator of World Aquatic Animal Day, together with Dean Kathy Hessler, who you'll hear from in a moment. What is World Aquatic Animal Day? Well, it's an annual day dedicated to aquatic animals. It was launched for the first time on 3rd of April 2020 and was a project co-founded by myself and Professor Kathy Hessler while we were at the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, an animal law clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School. The reason being is that we saw there was an urgent need to give aquatic animals the proper consideration that they deserve, and also that we needed to properly consider our interaction with them, our treatment of them, and the often devastating impacts we are having on them and their habitats. Therefore, on the 3rd of April every year, we celebrate these creatures and we call for action to protect them. Through law, policy, education, advocacy, and good stewardship of our earth, our efforts to raise awareness of the plight of aquatic animals must rise to meet the immense challenges they now face. With a different focus each year, we highlight these issues and aim to elevate their status. So who do we mean when we say aquatic animals? Well, many people tend to think of finfish. However, there's a huge number of different types of species and categories of aquatic animals, ranging from amphibians, crustaceans, finfish, marine mammals, mollusks, cephalopods, reptiles, echinoderms, Cnidaria, porifera, water birds, aquatic insects, and much more. So yes, all of those are aquatic animals, including coral and various other types. So as you can see, there's a large number of different types of animals, and we need to start to think about who they are if we want to think about protecting them and raising and elevating their status. But why do they matter? Well, again, people and humans tend to think that animals and aquatic animals matter because we need them, we use them, and we rely on them. However, they are important for themselves. They are individuals with intrinsic value and worth and deserve to be protected for themselves. They also are important for species survival as well as for the environment. And then, of course, also for us in the various relationships and interactions that we have with them. And how do we use and define them? Well, just like terrestrial animals, we use aquatic animals in a huge number of different ways, ranging from companion animals such as goldfish, for food and fiber. We use their skins and their fur. We use them in entertainment, from animals in aquaria all the way to movies and media. We use them as work animals, dolphins who were used in the Navy, in research and science, in education, in medicine, for beauty and cultural purposes, as decorations even. And then, of course, we further categorize them as pests or wildlife. And there's various other categorizations and uses of these animals, but this is just to illustrate some of the different ways. And why is this important? Well, because the ways that we use them often dictates the legal protections that we grant them. So one example is if an animal is a companion animal or a pet, they tend to get a lot more protection than an animal who is used in a laboratory or an animal who is used for food. So as we start to also think about aquatic animals in our advocacy efforts for animals or the environment and humans, we need to think of these different contexts in which they appear and how much legal protection, or rather how little legal protection and consideration we grant them based purely on the use, nothing to do with their capacities, but based on how we use them. That's important when we're trying to seek to get better protection, and it's also important for today's theme when we talk about alternatives to their use. So that brings us to alternatives to aquatic animal use. Before I go into specific instances, I did want to highlight the fact that aquatic animals are increasingly being seen as an alternative to terrestrial and other animal use. For example, we see a shift away from testing on animals such as primates or dogs, and an increase in testing on animals such as zebrafish. We also see people shifting away from eating animal products, including beef and chicken, towards eating fish and other aquatic animals. And the reason being is that many people consider or think that these animals are less sentient than other animals. For example, that fish are less sentient as opposed to primates or bunnies or and dogs. Advocates say that it's better than terrestrial animal farming because it uses less resources, ranging from foods to land to water, and also that it's better for the environment because there's less greenhouse gas emissions. And they even say that it's potentially a healthier choice, and also that some aquatic animals, such as oysters, actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. Therefore, in many ways, we see aquatic animals, seafood, as it's often referred to as being more sustainable than eating animals, terrestrial animals, and even more ethical. However, the fact is there's just not as much research relating to these animals, but the more research we do, we find that aquatic animals used in these circumstances, including through fishing and aquaculture, cause just as many problems and harms as terrestrial animal farming. And therefore, we really need more research, and we shouldn't be hunting aquatic animals as an alternative to other animal use. What we should be looking at is real alternatives to aquatic animals and other animals' use. An alternative is a propositional situation which offers a choice between two or more things. So actually, by increasing alternatives, what we're doing is we're offering the public, consumers, and others a choice between different products. This is important because increasingly the public and other experts and consumers are becoming more aware of the very vast and far-reaching harms of animal use and exploitation. This is across the spectrum of some of the uses that I've just mentioned. And it's actually becoming necessary for us to find alternatives. The current situation is simply unsustainable, unethical, and problematic for other reasons, of course. And then furthermore, thanks to advances in our technological industries and scientific knowledge, we now are able to produce and understand how to produce more effectively and efficiently more alternatives. And as these alternatives become more accessible and they become more effective and cheaper, they really will be likely to become the new norm, the new standard. I just wanted to pull out a couple of examples. I know there'll be some discussions on this today, but aquatic animals who are used as food, increasingly plant-based options for seafood are becoming widely accessible, for everything from tuna to fish fingers to fillets, all of those products. And then even soon there'll be cell-based or cellular seafood. So that will be coming soon when regulatory approvals and all other considerations are factored in. So in the food realm, there's many alternatives to aquatic animals being used as food, and also excitingly in entertainment. So instead of people swimming with real dolphins who have been captured from the wild, taken away from their families and otherwise injured, now be possible to get that same sort of satisfaction that people seek from robots. Obviously, these are still in new and developing stages, but it's exciting to think that there are alternatives without the harm and exploitation. Also in entertainment is the increase of virtual reality or VR, which allows people to have immersive experiences as if they're underwater without having to have, again, going to an aquarium where animals have been captured from the wild or bred in captivity. The final example is scientific research. And again, I know some of this will be discussed today, but just to give you a picture that the justification for using animals for testing is becoming increasingly unjustifiable. And there's now even more and more alternatives which are more effective and accurate than testing on animals. And there really is no need to keep using animal models. So it's exciting to see these alternatives. It's important to acknowledge that there's also challenges. And of course, there'll be cost factors to take into account, their accessibility, people accepting them, even professionals accepting them, the regulatory barriers that they might face, including their names, their labeling, the approvals they need, etc., various others. But the fact is that alternatives are here to stay and they are increasing. And, at some point in time, everything we use today was potentially considered as an alternative, and it could be considered just as an evolution, right? That's more sustainable, more effective, and of course, less cruel, which is what we're looking at minimizing and eliminating in our society. So today, we hope to shine a light on some of these alternatives. And of course, some of them you may be familiar with them, some of them you might not. They might be really interesting to you. Start thinking about how you yourself can implement these alternatives into your life, use them, challenge others to do the same. And as with all animals, human animals too, we need to evolve. And I argue that finding alternatives to aquatic animal use and including aquatic animals is part and is a critical part of our own human evolution. I'll end with a quote indicating that it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change. So with that, I'm going to close off. I wish you a wonderful and exciting day, and please don't forget to use the hashtag World Aquatic Animal Day. Enjoy. Thanks.
So, welcome to the 4th annual Aquatic Animal Day. Let's see. Great. So we start here at GW some of our conversations with a land and labor acknowledgement. In Washington, we honor the indigenous people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand, and they include the Anacostans, Pamunkey, Nintengo, Upper Mattapony, Rappahannock, Chickahominy, Monacan, Powhatan, and many other indigenous nations of the region. We also acknowledge that much of what we know of this area today was made possible from the forced labor of enslaved individuals and communities. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. We can learn much about respectful relationships with animals on the planet from these historical and present day societies. So I'm going to do an overview of things that our panelists won't have time to cover, but hopefully will be helpful as a background of understanding how animals are situated in the law. So we start these conversations by helping people understand that aquatic animals, like all animals, are deemed property under the law. They're all deemed owned, right? Owned by individuals and corporations, or owned/managed by governments. This status is contested. People are working on it and challenging it and saying it's not fully true everywhere anymore, which is nice. But this is the starting point for our legal conversations. And this ownership does not require responsible care. Owners can regulate all facets of the animals' lives that they control, and they're not required to protect them from harm. In fact, they're permitted to inflict harm upon them. If you think about situations like animals used in research, animals raised for food, and so on. So animals aren't seen as self-owning. They don't get to decide for themselves what happens to them. We have a similar legal problem with other humans who aren't seen as able to make their own decisions. So think about children. And we have legal remedies for those situations that we can begin to use in this context. Animals are seen as plentiful resources. They're seen as designed to be used, especially aquatic animals, and as useful or valuable only for human benefit or enjoyment. And so these are really problematic frameworks that we're working to overcome. Because animals aren't seen as valuable for themselves, it challenges their status within the law when we have these conversations in the legal framework. So the law doesn't really know what to do with animals in that context. It doesn't know how to attribute value to the animals themselves apart from whatever benefit they might derive to humans. It's not unusual, right? Because the law has that challenge to figure out what's the value of a human being, what's the value of the environment. So we can be connected to those conversations to learn from them and port those lessons over to our world. But we do know that when beings aren't valued, they don't receive protection. And this is a real problem. So this is where aquatic animals find themselves, right? And that approach leads to cruelty, abuse, neglect, and extinction, which is why we have to challenge it. Right? Okay, so we want to see animals and we want to understand them. And seeing aquatic animals is particularly challenging because we literally don't see them, right? They're in environments that we're not in. And when we don't see them, right, that lack of interaction can result in a lack of understanding what they need, who they are, and a lack of empathy, caring about what happens to them. We also tend to think of aquatic animals as having uncountable numbers, right? Unlimited resources that we can just use and use and use, and there won't be problems. We know now there are problems. But thinking of them in groups devalues them as individuals and makes it harder for us to think about those situations. So the need for legal protection and regulation of use and abuse is important. Helping see animals as valuable for themselves is a step in the right direction. And as Amy said, the alternatives are growing. And so pretty much every area in which we use aquatic animals, alternatives are developing, which is fabulous. Sentience is an important conversation in the aquatic animal realm. So all of the animals that you see on this slide are not only deemed scientifically, right, proven sentient, right, which means they can feel pain and they have some cognition, but they also have self-awareness, right? They've all passed the mirror self-recognition test, which is something that human children often don't pass until the age of 2 or beyond, right? And that means that when they see themselves in a mirror, they recognize that it is themselves and not another animal of the same species. And that's a high level of sophisticated cognitive capacity, as I said, that not all humans have. So what does that mean? So one of the things that's important to know is it's not just me saying that these animals are sentient. I've been saying it for a long time, but it's not just me, and it's not important when I say it. Scientists are saying, and so the growing body of scientific evidence supports this idea that these animals are sentient. And so it challenges this human-centric framework, which is good. And it's having the sentience science is having an impact on the legal realm, which is also really good. So the UK, you may know, has the sentience bill, which was including all vertebrates, right? Saying that they all can suffer pain and need protection. But after a significant amount of scientific sort of pushback with a lot of evidence, they included decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks because there's enough data to say they are sentient as well. So they've been added. Spain had already recognized that some animal sentience in their criminal code and now has added some to the civil code. The Alberta Court of Appeals case said that animals are living, feeling beings. And so these are just examples, right? This is not by any means an exhaustive list. 21 countries, at least in part, and the EU recognize sentience in animals. Some smaller jurisdictions, not at the country level. Oregon in the US, Quebec and Canberra outside the US, include sentience, right? They recognize sentience of animals. Now, they don't always recognize it for invertebrates or for aquatic animals. So we still have a long way to go. But studies are beginning to focus more on aquatic animals, including the welfare of wild-caught fish and fish in aquaculture settings. And this one is particularly interesting to me. There's a study about psychological preferences for cleaner wrasse. Those are the fish that eat the lice, right, off of other fish. So they work in symbiotic relationship with other fish. And people are trying to use them to eat the lice off salmon in aquaculture facilities. So they want to breed them to increase more of the ones who have the preference for salmon lice, which means that the psychological studies, right, of cleaner wrasse fish, they recognize there's a psychological component, right? And they want more with that attribute or capacity. So sentience should result in legal protections, right? We already have an existing duty to avoid unnecessary harm and suffering to animals, but we don't know exactly what's unnecessary. We don't define harm and suffering. So these are conversations we need to have. We need to impose upon ourselves a duty to use and create alternatives to the use of these animals. And we need to shift our defaults using the precautionary principle, which basically says, if we think something we're going to do is going to cause harm, we should stop, see if there's an alternative to it, see if we can mitigate it before we move forward with that harmful behavior. I also suggest that we should assume sentience unless otherwise proved, right? Because every species that we've investigated scientifically, we find sentience. And it doesn't make sense that animals wouldn't have the ability to avoid harmful stimuli, right? It just doesn't make sense. So I'm suggesting we flip the default and shift the burden of proof to people who want to use them to prove that they wouldn't be harmed. And we could create some standards forcing legislation that says, we're going to stop using these animals by, 2030, right? And then even if we don't have the technology now, we can get there by that time. And that's a way to get there. Okay, so really quickly, some uses. You're probably a little bit familiar with the aquaculture and wild-caught fishing categories, right? The numbers of animals is just devastating. So we talk about 178 million tons of animals. And we say tons because they don't count individual animals. The numbers are too vast, right? And they just put them in these categories of weight. So the numbers are phenomenal when you think about the harm, obviously, to those individual animals, to their ecosystems, to their habitats, and to their species. So this is something we have to take very seriously. And it's not just finfish or some of even the crustaceans and mollusks you might be thinking of. We take out of the oceans 36 million tons of aquatic algae every year. Think about what that does to the ecosystem, right? We take out all kinds of other animals I won't go into right now, but 20 million tons of the animals we take out aren't for human food, right? They're for fish meal, they're feeding other fish, right? They're used as bait, they're used in drugs. And this is a significant problem generically, and we can talk about it more later, but we also have discard. 35% of the animals caught are lost or wasted, right? So if you're thinking 178 million tons, 35% is that just wasted, right? We have significant problems to address. And we're thinking that by 2027, actually, that 100% of the fisheries are going to be maximally fished, right? And some are going to be overfished. So we have significant problems to address. We have other uses. And again, this is just to give you a snapshot, a quick background of what's going on. So we have alligator farming, right? We have over 250,000 in the US alone every year. Crocodiles, 1.2 million just in Thailand annually. Pearls, 700 tons. Think about how little a pearl weighs and how many pearls in 700 tons. 264 tons of mother of pearl, right, products. Sea cucumbers, most people don't know they're animals, but they are, and they're endangered, 43,000 tons annually. Japanese sea cucumbers, just those, 201,500 tons. Goldfish in the US, right? 200 to 250 million bred just in the US every year. Sharks, we have 73 million killed in the global trade every year, and 273 million fishing deaths. We have the export of sponges and corals that amounts to 1.9 billion with a B dollars. Like the trade we're talking is vast, it's enormous. Zebrafish, we have millions of zebrafish being bred to be used in labs worldwide every year. We have dolphins used by the Navy. We have octopus being bred for research, and we have 3.7 million tons of them being caught, mostly for food. Sea cucumbers, and we have illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. We have sharks and rays just killed by bycatch, right? By accident, 68,000 a year. 7.6 million in the US aquarium fish per year, right? And we have over 1 billion fish sort of out there in the global aquarium trade, right? So these numbers are astounding. And when you realize how they're used, you recognize that we have a lot of work to do. So we need to stop seeing animals in the natural world primarily as a resource for human use. And we have to recognize that fishing and aquaculture are not the only exploitative and extractive uses, right? We have deep sea mining, we have oil exploration, we have lots of other uses that are damaging those habitats. So we need to consider the animals themselves in any sustainability analysis for their own sake, for their species and the environment. And when we fail to do this, it hurts the environment, it impoverishes the development of the law, it hinders creation of appropriate mechanisms to restrain the cruelty and abuse humans inflict on these animals, and it constrains our understanding, our conceptualization and implementation of animal protection measures and understanding how animals fit into the environment. It deprioritizes the enforcement of the laws we already have to protect animals, and we know doing better is going to take a significant amount of work. But if we decide that animals are not our property, our products, or ours, then we can make some improvements relatively quickly, right? If we include animal interests explicitly in our decision-making, if we can accept that science shows other non-human animals feel and have capacities that we need to acknowledge, if we accept the legal obligation to do no unnecessary harm or suffering to those capacities, and if we reframe our relationship with animals within the law and other disciplines, within the natural world and beyond, then we can begin to look for ways to mutually, in a mutually supportive way, coexist. So really quickly, I'll go over a couple areas of law that are evolving. Octopus farming is really popular right now, but there's a moratorium, a temporary injunction for the Hawaiian operation. And we don't know about the status of the permit in the Canary Islands for the Spanish company yet. The Washington state had a bill trying to ban octopus farming, and it was voted out of committee, which was great, but it died thereafter. People may know about the vaquita. There are only 10 left, and Mexico has not been protecting them. So just last week, CITES decided to issue trade sanctions on Mexico. And so of their 3,150 plant and animal species, they can no longer trade them because they're not protecting the vaquita. We know that corals are in danger. They're more danger than we had thought before, and scientists are looking at artificial intelligence to figure out where to site coral and using robot arms to transplant coral. And we've discovered some new coral reefs, which is positive. We have a federal court ruling that says the National Marine Fisheries Service has failed to protect endangered humpback whales from fishing gear entanglements on the Pacific coast, despite finding that there was a 400% increase in whale mortality and serious injury from human cause just since 2018. Salmon is an active area for the law. Many of you may have heard that it looks like the California salmon fishery is closed for the entire year, and maybe the entire Pacific coast is closing because there simply aren't enough salmon. Although as a result, right, people are pushing for aquaculture. And so Scotland is trying to get the third deep sea salmon aquaculture facility established. There was a settlement in Oregon with the Department of Forestry saying they hadn't done enough to prevent harm to salmon by, building roads on riparian ways and not having buffer zones. NOAA is announcing, however, that they're going to allow fish farming in the Gulf of Mexico, which would be 20 facilities and up to 64 million pounds of fish annually. But there's some other good news. So the UN treaty, right, on marine biodiversity, people may have heard about, right? So that was approved by 190 countries. So we all have to have the countries domestically ratify and adopt language. So we'll see what happens with that. I mentioned the UK sentience bill, and I just have a list here of some of the most endangered aquatic animals, which is sad. So I won't read them all out, but we can talk about that later. But I want to end with some good news. So just a few days ago, we found out that there was an agreement to rehome Tokatai, also known as Lolita, from Seaquarium in Miami. And so we're looking forward to hearing more about that as the days evolve. But I want to stop now and turn it over to our wonderful panel. And thank you. Let's, thank you.
All right. Just introduce you if you don't mind. All right, everyone, our next speaker is Leah Curran-Moon, the CEO and co-founder of DC Vegan, my personal favorite restaurant in the city. Leah is a dancer, a performance artist, and gender studies scholar who holds a PhD in public policy and public administration from GW, as well as a MPA in public administration and a BA in urban studies from Cleveland State University. And she is a vegan for the animals. So there you go. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dean Hessler. It's such a joy to be here. Like you said, my name is Leah Curran-Moon. I am the CEO and co-founder of DC Vegan, along with my partner, Michael, who is here today as well. The title of my talk is Alternatives to Eating Animals, Approachability as a Starting Point. So DC Vegan, how many people here have been to DC Vegan? Yes, it's like majority. Thank you. Thanks for your support. DC Vegan was founded in 2015 as a catering company. We're the only plant-based caterer, full service caterer here in the whole region. So we started in 2015 in Union Kitchen, which is a food incubator here. We rented a half of a prep table, and it was just Michael and myself and our chef. And we have evolved and grown over the past several years. We're in our 9th year in business. And in 2021, we opened DC Vegan in DuPont Circle on 17th and P. We opened our deli, which is the top photo, our deli and our cheese shop, which is kind of lunchy, casual food. We added our vegan cheese shop a few months ago, which is artisanal vegan cheeses. They're so good. And then we opened our botanical bar, which is a full service Italian American restaurant in 2022. So the sort of big lines of business that we have are catering and the restaurant. The catering is really interesting because we are a primarily corporate caterer. We also cater weddings and social events and that kind of thing too. But catering gives us this really unique opportunity to feed people their first plant-based meal a lot of times, because maybe the people ordering the catering are vegan or doing it for some, are plant-based for some reason, but a lot of the guests attending the events are not. So we are uniquely positioned to introduce people to plant-based food for the first time. And that's a really unique opportunity and responsibility that we have as DC Vegan. So moving on. normally I would not talk about myself in a presentation, but I think my sort of career trajectory has some relevance here. This is a very full circle moment for me. I did a PhD here in the Trachtenberg School. There's the School of Media and Public Affairs that I completed in 2011, and I've been involved in social justice work my entire career. So as an academic, I worked on anti-poverty policy, urban economic development policy, health equity. The issue that was the most near and dear to my heart was women's studies, gender studies, feminist social policy work. I taught here in the School of Gender Studies. I taught Intro to Women's Studies. I taught a really fun gender and art course, queer politics. So I taught here for quite a long time. And in 2014, 2015, I needed to move out of academia. I just needed to take a little break. And so my partner and I launched DC Vegan. And while it seems really, really unrelated, DC Vegan launched as a social justice business. So bringing sort of all of this work on anti-racism, anti-sexism, animal welfare, that I had done as an academic, bringing it to entrepreneurship, bringing it to launching a social justice business. So DC Vegan is very proud to be a social justice business. And what I mean by that is sort of intersectional feminism is our starting point. That's our starting point with our sort of leadership structure, with our organizational culture, with our marketing choices, with everything. That's sort of where we start. And then we're vegan for the animals as well. So the reason that we're doing this, the reason that a move from academic and social justice work in the academy worked for me, the reason that this move worked for me was because we could do something for the animals, because we could make the world a kinder, more just place for them through this sort of different pursuit. We're also vegan for the planet and vegan for our bodies. So what does this look like in terms of boots on the ground? How does this sort of food activism work for us? How do we put it into action? And what we learned over the course of doing this for all of these years is that approachable cuisine is sort of our secret weapon. So what I mean by that is we create cuisine that is familiar in flavors and textures and ingredients, familiar in the cuisine itself. So we focus on Italian American cuisine. And we do that for the very specific reason that I was talking about before, that we are uniquely positioned to introduce people to vegan food, often for the first time. So our mission is to open people's minds to plant-based food. And we do that through this approachability. So we're very intentional about the foods that we create. Different restaurants around here, like Elizabeth's Gone Raw or Fancy Radish, they're just like really pushing the cuisine forward with these beautiful, beautiful creations. And we love it. Our approach is just a little bit different. We're focusing on like, how can this be so easy for people? How can your uncle from the Midwest really relate to what they're eating, right? And that's we test it like on my dad, who like only eats corn, like that's the only vegetable he eats, right? And so we're like, okay, if he'll eat it, then we're winning. And there's a political reason that we're doing that, although it looks just like beautiful food or something. There's a real mission behind it. And then our other activist goal is sort of normalizing this word vegan. So when I taught in women's studies here about 10 or 12 years ago, the word feminism was seen as a pejorative, right? Like people didn't want to touch that word. And it has changed so much over the past decade. Like I couldn't believe a few years ago when I walked into H&M and I saw this t-shirt that said feminist on it. I was like, wow, times are really changing. Our goal is to help nudge it along around the word vegan. So there was a lot of talk when we started, are we using this word in our name or are we not? Oh, it causes this knee jerk for a lot of people, right? And we decided to, hey, we're going to foreground that word and we're going to really own it. And we're going to, through that, kind of work to destabilize this negativity around it. So yeah, those are our sort of activist goals as a business. Let's see. I'm not moving. Aquatic animal alternatives. So what aquatic animal alternatives do we use at DC Vegan? So we primarily focus on plant-forward options in our cooking. So using the most vegetable-forward options that we can. So if you've been to DC Vegan, you may have tried the king trumpet calamari, which is pictured here. It is the most popular item on our menu. We kind of make calamari out of king trumpet mushrooms. We also serve an oysters mushroom Rockefeller. We've got a Caesar salad here, which uses sunflower seeds and capers to get that kind of briny, rich flavor instead of anchovies. We've got also have our Chesapeake fritters here, which use sustainable hearts of palm instead of crabs. In terms of mock meats, we don't use those quite as much, but we sometimes do. We had a big St. Patrick's Day party and we served fish and chips. We served good catch fish. We also sell an algae-based caviar in our cheese shop that we can't keep on the shelves. So those are some of the aquatic animal alternatives that we use in our cooking on a daily basis. And then, we in a couple weeks are doing a partnership event with Finless Foods, who is creating plant-based tuna, and they also have a cell-based tuna that they're creating, and I'm really curious about that. We're not working with that product. I'm really interested in what the ethical conversations around that are. We weren't quite ready to make that leap or ready to consider it, but as I look towards the future, that's a really interesting conversation that I'm curious about the landscape of. So yeah, that's DC Vegan. And thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Davis, and I am your other moderator for this event. And I'm here to introduce Madeline Cohen. Madeline Cohen is the Senior Regulatory Attorney at the Good Food Institute, or GFI. GFI is a 501c3 nonprofit developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply by accelerating the world's transition to alternative proteins. Madeline leads GFI's regulatory and litigation strategies related to fair labeling of alternative proteins. She works to ensure that alternative proteins have a level regulatory playing field and are not burdened by unfair and unconstitutional labeling restrictions. Her areas of expertise include constitutional law, alternative protein regulation, and litigation. Before joining GFI, Madeline worked as an associate at the law firm Wiley Ryan LLP and as a law clerk to federal judge Robert C. Chambers. Madeline is also an alumna of GW Law class of 2014. Please welcome Madeline.
Thanks. So I'm going to be talking some more about alternatives to seafood and how they can create a more sustainable, just, and humane seafood supply. So GFI is a nonprofit organization, and as Kelly mentioned, we're trying to create a more sustainable, healthy, and just food supply. We do that primarily through three programmatic areas of work. So we have a science and technology department that both does its own original research, and we have a research grant program where we fund alternative protein companies or academics that are willing to do open access research in this space. We have a corporate engagement team that specifically works with companies, especially small businesses and startups, to help them break through into the alternative protein industry. And then we have our policy team where we do a range of work. We do regulatory and legislative advocacy. We're involved in some impact litigation. And then we also work with multilateral organizations to push for global regulatory harmonization that might affect these foods. And our theory of change is essentially that we're not going to be able to change enough people's mind by just trying to convince them to stop eating animals. And so instead of asking people to stop eating foods they love, we want to make these alternatives taste the same or better and cost the same or less as the conventional animal products that people are currently eating. So before I dive into the alternatives, I just have some quick points on the current state of seafood, some of which Dean Hessler already covered. But there is just a massive demand for seafood, both here in the US and globally. As Dean Hessler mentioned already, and these are old numbers by this point, these are 2018 numbers, but 60% of wild fisheries were maximally fished, which means we can't take any more before they become overfished. And 34% are already overfished, which means we're depleting them faster than the fish can be replenished, which leaves us with very little wild fish left to be caught. And aquaculture, of course, has been proposed as a solution to this demand problem. But a 2017 FAO study said that we can only meet the demand for seafood with aquaculture in 17 countries. And that leaves most of the world with more demand for seafood than we have supply. IUU fishing just makes this problem worse. It's really hard to track. A lot of this is happening in international waters. There's also the issue of smaller illegal fishing boats doing the actual fishing and then transferring their loads to bigger permitted boats that then come and drop it off in port. So even in countries that do closely regulate fishing, we don't necessarily know where those fish are coming from and who's catching them, how much bycatch they have, et cetera. And this definitely affects the global seafood market, but most importantly, it affects those populations in rural countries that are economically vulnerable and often are fishing just for their own sustenance or for a very meager income to help their families survive. And if we don't fix this supply-demand problem, we have 800 million people that are at risk of malnutrition or food insecurity. And then, of course, there's all of the environmental effects of our conventional seafood industry. We are currently overfishing to the extent that we're having these cascading effects on entire aquatic ecosystems. Also, the bycatch can destabilize these ecosystems as well. And it also means that we're catching fish and mammals and turtles and birds and other species that aren't even being used as food. We're just catching them, killing them, throwing them back. Fishing vessels also themselves cause a lot of emissions, a lot of pollution, and those emissions are actually going up as these boats have to go further and further from shore to meet their quotas because of these dwindling fisheries. And then trawling, which is one of the most profitable forms of fishing, can damage coral reefs and the sea floor and actually can release stored carbon from the sea floor into the ocean. So jumping now into the alternative, just an overview of alternative seafoods. Some of these have already been discussed, but there's, of course, plant-based products that can be made from pretty much any plant out there. Then you have fermentation-derived products. So if you've ever had anything from the company Quorn, Quorn, those are fermentation-derived, and they use mycelium, which is a type of fungi root that you can produce really quickly through fermentation so that you can make a lot of it pretty cost-effectively, efficiently, and sustainably. And then there is cultivated or cell-cultured seafood, where you take a couple of cells from a fish or shellfish animal, and then you essentially recreate the biological process that would normally happen in the animal to grow muscle and cell tissue, but you do it inside of a cultivator, which essentially looks like the kind of tank that you would brew beer in. And you end up with, say a whole salmon product like you have right there from wild type foods. And there is a bunch of companies right now that are kind of in the R&D stage for cultivated seafood, including for Atlantic salmon, for bluefin tuna, for scallops, for oysters. So there's a lot of potential there, even though those are not quite on the market yet. And alternative seafood has a lot of benefits aside from the obvious animal welfare benefits. It's a huge market opportunity. We eat an estimated 200 to 300 different species of seafood right now, which means there's all sort of opportunities for businesses to get into this industry and not necessarily have direct competition because there's always going to be another potential species. It also allows for consistent quality and efficiency and sustainability. There's no bycatch. We're not making food or using raw ingredients that aren't actually ending up on someone's plate. And of course, it comes without all of those negative environmental externalities that we just talked about. It's also not reliant on wild populations. So you can keep creating this food all year round, which could potentially, once these products are less expensive, be really beneficial for those vulnerable communities that are depending on seasonal fishing for sustenance. We also don't have to worry about geographical considerations. So these products can be made inland. We can set up manufacturing facilities in rural communities and kind of spread out the supply chain for these foods. And that also means more safe and stable jobs. So instead of fishing being maybe a seasonal job or a job where there are some physical safety risks and some humanitarian concerns, these can be jobs that people have all year round. And then we don't have the health risks that are associated with conventional fish consumption. Despite all of those benefits, there are definitely some regulatory and financial hurdles that these products are currently facing that they'll have to overcome if we really want this industry to grow. So on the regulatory side, looking first at cultivated seafood, FDA has regulatory authority over these products, with the small exception of catfish, which for reasons that are complicated and political and will take forever to explain, is partly regulated by USDA. But otherwise, for most of the cultivated seafood that will be ending up on our plates, FDA is going to have authority. And they have authority both over the food safety aspects of the products and then over labeling. And on the food safety side, because cultivated is a brand new technology and these foods aren't already on the market, there's going to be these pre-market safety evaluations that FDA will do in consultation with the companies to make sure that these products are safe for human consumption. 2 cultivated chicken products have already recently completed this process, but no cultivated seafood has yet, but they'll go through the exact same process with FDA. And FDA said that they're going to put out some guidance on this pre-market consultation process, which should make it easier and more transparent for companies to know what the agency is looking for. On the labeling side, FDA put out a request for public comment on how these products should be labeled. Supporters of these products want them to be labeled with something neutral, like cultivated or cell cultured. Opponents of these products tend to want to use more disparaging terms like lab grown or in vitro, which are really inaccurate because at scale, these products are not going to be made in a lab. They'll be made in the same kind of food production facility that might make cereal or frozen pizza or something like that. And then on the plant-based and fermentation-derived seafood side, things are a little bit simpler. Most of these products have been on the market in some form or fashion, so they don't usually require any type of pre-market authorization unless they're going to include a novel food additive that hasn't been used before, in which case they'll need to either go through a petition process with FDA or they'll need to certify that their product is generally recognized as safe or GRAS. And then in terms of food labeling, FDA doesn't have specific regulations for plant-based meats or seafood yet. So right now, companies just need to make sure that these products are labeled in a way that's accurate, not going to be misleading to consumers. But FDA has said they'll be putting out draft guidance on labeling of plant-based alternatives to animal-derived foods. So that will likely have some effect on how the plant-based seafood products can be labeled. And unfortunately, there are some states that have big traditional seafood or meat industries that don't want common sense labeling of these products and have passed what we refer to as label censorship laws. And generally, these laws say something like you can't call a veggie burger a burger, or you can't call a plant-based fish fillet fish. And we've been challenging these laws partly successfully in a number of states. We've worked with the ACLU and the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and the Plant-Based Food Association is also involved in some of this litigation. And the primary argument against these laws is that they violate the First Amendment's commercial speech protection. The First Amendment protects both a company's right to disseminate accurate, not misleading commercial information, and also a consumer's right to receive accurate information about a product. And the states that have passed these laws have said it's to prevent consumer confusion, but when pressed on summary judgment, can't ever actually come up with any evidence of consumer confusion. And there are several studies finding the opposite, that consumers aren't confused by these labels and actually using words that describe what the product tastes like or the texture of the use is a lot more helpful. So plant-based fish sticks is a lot more helpful than plant-based sticks would be to consumers. Fortunately, some of these laws don't apply to seafood, but some do. And so far, courts have struck some of these laws down or parts of these laws down on First Amendment grounds and also on due process grounds. Some of them are super vague with the way that they've worded their bans, and it's impossible to know whether your label does or doesn't violate the law. And some of these laws do come with criminal penalties, including jail time. So that due process argument has been successful in some cases. And then these laws also potentially violate the Dormant Commerce Clause to the extent that they're putting a burden on interstate commerce. And also some of them are probably preempted by some federal labeling provisions, but we haven't so far had any courts touch those issues yet in our litigation. Another big problem for alternative seafood is there's just no public funding out there. There is some amount of public funding for other types of alternative proteins, cultivated and plant-based meat and poultry products. But so far, there's been absolutely no government funding for research specific to seafood alternatives. Even though there's a lot of state and federal legislators and agencies whose mission kind of aligns with the promotion of these products. You've got a whole list of agencies here who have loan programs, tax incentive programs, research programs that are intended to create more sustainable food systems or job creation or food security, but they have not yet seen the light when it comes to alternative proteins. So just a few takeaways on what we need in order to make the alternative seafood industry flourish. As I just mentioned, government funding is probably the place where we need to start. When it comes to what we can do about that, I would just say spread the word about these products, about what they are, and also all of their potential benefits. We have potential benefits for jobs and the economy and food security and climate and sustainability and all of these things that, our legislators say they care about. And I think they just need to know that these are a really big opportunity. We also need a regulatory playing field that treats the alternatives fairly and doesn't put them at a disadvantage to animal products just because some states have more ingrained traditional animal or seafood agriculture. And finally, we just need everybody to be involved. As the numbers that Dean Hessler showed, the traditional seafood industry is a behemoth, and there's no way that a bunch of startups are going to be able to tackle that alone. So we believe in working with everyone. If there are commercial fishing operations or big seafood companies that are willing to work with alternative seafood and share, those supply chains and those distribution agreements, that's at least a foot in the door. We need to work with farmers and ingredient suppliers who can make products that will make the plant-based seafood even better. We need environmental NGOs and public health NGOs and multilateral organizations to kind of understand how alternative proteins can fit within their mission and then help spread the word about these products. We, of course, need restaurants and food service to realize how amazing these products are and that they can make money off of them. And then we need public and private investment so that we can actually meet this growing seafood demand in a way that's just and sustainable. Thank you.
Hello again. Next up is Dr. Catherine Krebs. Catherine Krebs is a medical research specialist with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, where she primarily focuses on National Institutes of Health policies and strategies to push the agency toward the most ethical and effective biomedical research. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. Just getting the slides set up. But I'm going to be talking about the ways that the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine is aiming to reduce and replace aquatic animals in medical research and testing. And so I'm going to give first, an overview of a project that I've been working on for a couple of years now, focusing on getting protections for cephalopods in US federally funded research. And then I'm going to give a brief roundup of some of the other efforts we have going on at the Physicians Committee, such as replacing horseshoe crabs for endotoxin testing, replacing live fish for ecotoxicology testing, and then reducing and replacing the broad use of aquatic animals in projects funded by the National Institutes of Health. So for those that may not know, cephalopods are a class of marine mollusks, including squids, octopuses like the one shown here, cuttlefish, and nautiluses. They are super special animals. They're highly intelligent. They have complex nervous systems, unique behavioral repertoires, and they have capacity for pain, distress, and suffering. These animals urgently need protections in United States research. Because they are invertebrates, meaning they don't have a backbone, they're excluded from the policies that govern the care and use of laboratory animals. And yet there's evidence that their use in research is only increasing. So the first major argument for getting more protections for cephalopods in research is their intelligence. They demonstrate qualities like memory, learning, personality, and sentience. Octopuses, for example, have been observed using tools like this one, carrying around a shell that he might use to hide from predators. And much like humans, cephalopod memory is impacted by its environment. So one study showed that cuttlefish raised in an enriched environment performed better in long-term memory tasks than those reared in impoverished environments. Another argument is their capacity for pain. So this is a list of 8 criteria that indicate an animal can experience pain, including things like having the type of neuronal receptors that detect painful stimuli, like hot temperatures, displaying avoidance behavior in response to an injury or threat, and having responses to pain affected by local anesthetics. Octopuses meet 7 of these 8 criteria with high confidence, and other cephalopod species meet a range of 2 to 6 of these criteria. And this demonstrates with little doubt that these animals can feel pain and that they're sentient, which of course has major implications for the care and use of these animals, especially in invasive experiments. In a captive setting, there are many different ways that a cephalopod can experience pain and distress. And I'm going to give you a brief rundown of their highly specialized needs in captivity using this Hawaiian day octopus as an example. So first, they must be transported in well-oxygenated seawater in a container that's strong enough to prevent being ruptured by biting, and that is temperature controlled and kept dark to reduce stress. Because transport causes unavoidable stress, it's important to allow them time to acclimate to their new conditions and to monitor them closely for signs of successful acclimation. Their tanks must be, they must have adequate seawater circulation to remove waste and ensure water quality parameters are maintained. Oxygen, pH, carbon dioxide, nitrogenous compounds, and salinity must be monitored regularly and maintained to avoid distress and disease. Lighting conditions affect many different behavioral and physiological characteristics and must be changed gradually to avoid startling, which can cause escape behaviors or inking. Temperature conditions are also very important and quite specific, sometimes even to individual animals. Cephalopods are sensitive to noise and vibration to the point that noise-producing support functions like tank and filter washing should be separated from housing and experimental areas. Improper social housing can be extremely dangerous. Octopuses are solitary and must be housed individually. Cephalopods need enrichment in their environment to maintain physically and mentally healthy activity levels and to avoid abnormal sleep patterns or rest patterns, deviant, destructive, or self-destructive behavior. One way to do this is by providing food inside of a puzzle box or other objects for them to interact with. Cephalopods should only be handled by competent, trained personnel using techniques that minimize the potential for injury and reduced stress. Their skin is extremely delicate, and every effort should be made to minimize handling. And lastly, indicators of health and welfare that should be measured and recorded at least daily include skin texture, skin color, skin integrity, body morphology, eye position, color, motor coordination, changes in social interactions, feeding behaviors, defecation, and inking. And these are only some of the welfare considerations that are necessary for captive cephalopods based on these guidelines for the care and welfare of cephalopods in research, which were developed in 2015, prompted by the EU directive, which established protections for cephalopods for scientific purposes in the EU. And this paper describing enrichment for octopuses. And for the sake of time, I haven't even scratched the surface of considerations for cephalopods during experimental procedures. It's important to note that each species of cephalopods and sometimes individual animals have different needs. But right now in the US, none of these and the many, many more care and use guidelines for cephalopods are mandated, and neither is the oversight for their use. Despite these troubling facts, there is evidence that the number of cephalopods being used in research is increasing. There is no way to track the number of cephalopods being used in research labs, in part because their use isn't regulated, but the number of publications referencing cephalopods in the NIH's publications database PubMed is increasing, which indicates an increase in their use. And a lot of this research is actually being enabled by the NIH and other agencies like the NSF that are actively turning them into model organisms like lab rats or mice. This is a screenshot from a federally funded institution that breeds and supplies cephalopods at multiple life stages for researchers for experimentation. So United States animal welfare policy is falling behind, and it's failing cephalopods because laboratory animal welfare regulations only apply to vertebrates. This is the Public Health Service Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. And as you can see, it defines animal as any live vertebrate animal. And so I'm going to walk you through some of the implications of cephalopods and other invertebrates being excluded from this policy. The first is that institutions aren't required to form institutional animal care and use committees to provide oversight of animal research protocols involving cephalopods. And because IACUCs, which is the abbreviation for Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, because they aren't required to review cephalopod protocols, all of the consideration that goes into whether experimental animal use is approved is not required. So even basic things like the rationale and purpose for using animals, or the availability of less invasive procedures or non-animal protocols, are not required to be considered. Any oversight and protections for cephalopods are left completely up to individual institutions on a voluntary basis. In 2020, we conducted a survey of IACUC websites, and out of 147, we found that only 15 of them indicated that they cover invertebrates or cephalopods in addition to vertebrates. So other policies that cephalopods are left out of is this one that mandates animal facilities to report the average daily inventory of animals. And this is an important transparency measure that we can use to track the number of animals that are used in research. As well as this one that mandates the reporting of non-compliances and protocol deviations, which sometimes result in injury, harm, or death to the animals. At which point, labs are required to provide a plan of action to avoid this from happening again, And if that's insufficient, NIH's Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare has the power to shut down activities. But without these oversight measures, researchers aren't required to justify the use of animals or even to mitigate their pain. There's a complete lack of transparency and there is no avenue for accountability. There are several governing regions across the globe that have already extended animal protection legislation or policies to protect cephalopods, including Canada, the United Kingdom, Norway, Switzerland, the European Union, Australia, and New Zealand. We propose the following policy solutions to protect cephalopods. First, to update the definition of animal in the Public Health Service Policy on Humane Care and Use of Laboratory Animals to include cephalopods. So that was that definition I mentioned earlier that defines animal as vertebrate animals. Second, this policy actually mandates the use of guidelines called the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals. And what the first solution would do is it would set forth a necessary update to this guidelines. And so we could include guidelines for the care and use of cephalopods used in research contexts. We propose that until this happens, there should be a moratorium on new cephalopod research. And then lastly, we propose replacing invasive research using cephalopods with non-animal human-specific approaches or non-invasive wildlife approaches. So in 2020, along with a coalition of scientists and public interest groups led by the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Clinic, we sent a petition to the NIH asking for the establishment of federal research protections for cephalopods. There was a little bit of back and forth that summer, but it's been almost 3 years since then, and the agency has yet to take action. So last summer, we ramped up our efforts. We held a congressional briefing about the issue, and thanks to leadership from Representative Seth Moulton and Senators Cory Booker and Sheldon Whitehouse, both the House and the Senate took action to address this gap in welfare policies by sending letters to the NIH reiterating our requests from the original petition. And as this next session of Congress is underway, we are continuing to work with lawmakers to get these important changes made. So stay tuned for updates. But I just want to reiterate that the acceptance of these measures would be the bare minimum. The best case scenario is that it would lead to a reduction in the overall use of cephalopods for research. But ultimately, these animals belong in the ocean, not in our laboratories. In the context of health research, we need to be moving toward more human-specific approaches that are better at predicting human health outcomes. For basic research, it's possible to learn a world of information from these animals without holding them captive or performing painful experiments on them. So to switch gears a little bit, our team is working on other efforts to reduce and replace aquatic animals in research and testing. And the first one I will go over is our efforts to replace horseshoe crabs. So horseshoe crabs, like the ones seen here, are a crucial part of their ecosystems, but habitat loss paired with overharvesting for medical use have begun to cause concern for these animals' future. Their populations are declining and they are currently listed as vulnerable to extinction. There is a default safety test for all injectable therapies and vaccines that uses the blood of horseshoe crabs, which is not only harmful to the animals because it requires a needle in their hearts to drain a large portion of their blood, as you can see here, but it also introduces the risk of supply disruption since an entire industry depends on the blood of a wild animal. Fortunately, though, there is a scalable synthetic non-animal test called recombinant factor C, or RFC, that has been shown to be scientifically superior than the test that uses horseshoe crab blood. Currently, regulatory policies in the US make it more burdensome for industry to use RFC, but my colleagues are working directly with Congress, industry, and regulatory agencies to ensure that in time, all drugs and vaccines are tested using non-animal methods without horseshoe crab blood. Next, I want to talk about the use of live fish for ecological testing. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, is a global advisory body that, among other activities, sets international chemical testing guidelines. These guidelines are used throughout the world to assess chemical safety, and Physicians Committee staff lead animal protection activities at the OECD, which involves integrating non-animal approaches into international testing guidelines. In 2021, 3 of the 4 new guidelines that were adopted were non-animal methods, which is a huge victory. And one of these new guidelines describes the use of a cell line derived from rainbow trout to identify ecological hazards to fish and other wildlife. In February, as a part of the Physicians Committee Dynamic Discussions, continuing education program for regulatory toxicologists, attendees learned about how to use this fish cell line to predict toxicity in wildlife and replace traditional live fish tests. And then lastly, I want to talk about the use of other aquatic animals in medical research. If I were to list all of the animals that are used in medical research, it would require another 15 minutes. So I'm not going to do that, but I will tell you that about half of the NIH budget, which, what was it this year, $50 billion or so, goes toward research that uses animals. And due to a lack of agency transparency, we don't know exactly how much of that goes to aquatic animals. But the Physicians Committee is working hard to shift away from this paradigm that relies so heavily on animals. So this is a figure of an NIH-funded study that studies tissue regeneration using the salamander axolotl. And what they do is they just chop their tails off. So this is just one example of one species that is used. In December, after years of mounting pressure from my team and other animal advocates, the NIH established a working group to figure out how to increase their investment in non-animal methods. And so while we won't see this investment until 2024 at the earliest, it is a huge step in the right direction for this agency that has for decades been reliant on animals, aquatic and otherwise. So with extra funds for non-animal methods, researchers can take advantage of improved infrastructure and training for valuable human-specific experimental platforms like tissue chips. And the scientific community can begin to make real progress in shifting away from animals, benefiting the animals and the patients alike. So thank you very much to my team at the Physicians Committee. And I also want to acknowledge the work of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program for their efforts on the cephalopod issue. Thank you very much.
All righty, and I'll be introducing Dr. Naomi Rose. Dr. Naomi Rose is the marine mammal scientist for the Animal Welfare Institute, AWI, in Washington, D.C. She campaigns internationally to end cetacean live capture, trade, and commercial display, and to improve captive marine mammal welfare. She has been a member of the International Whaling Commission's Scientific Committee since 2000, where she participates in the subcommittees on environmental concerns, small cetaceans, and whale watching. Dr. Rose is also an AWI representative in a coalition of nonprofit organizations devoted to defending and strengthening the United States Marine Mammal Protection Act. She has testified before the U.S. Congress 4 times, at the Canadian Parliament, and at several federal and state legislative and regulatory hearings. She gave a TED Talk in Bend, Oregon in April 2015 on captive orca welfare. She received a PhD in biology from the University of California at Santa Cruz in 1992, where her dissertation examined the social dynamics of free-ranging male orcas. Dr. Rose has worked in the marine mammal advocacy field for 30 years. Please welcome Dr. Rose.
So I'm going to try to go through this pretty fast so that we can leave time for questions. And I took a different approach from most of the other folks. I was actually trying to think about alternatives for the animals as opposed to alternatives for people in terms of how can they get their entertainment by these, through these animals. So I'm going to be talking about captive marine mammals, so totally switching from fish. Let's do that. Maybe not. What am I supposed to be?
Arrow.
Yes, or this?
That one.
You might have to click with the mouse on the platform. Use a mouse.
Ah, there we go. So these are some of the marine mammals that are frequently held in captivity. Basically, the whales and dolphins and the seals and sea lions, but also polar bears, sea otters, and manatees, although they're not considered marine mammals by most folks. Under the law they are, and ecologically they are. So the first thing that's really different for these animals is space. All right, so this is a dive of a male orca, right, in the Pacific Northwest. Goes from left to right. The yellow line is him swimming around underneath the surface of the water. He went down to 525 feet, which is there at the bottom, and he did something down there. He didn't just go down there and come right back up. He's probably chasing a fish. So the whole dive from left to right took 5 minutes, and it was one dive out of many during the day. Going down to 500 feet is totally normal for these animals, pretty much for every species I could mention, including sea otters. Going down to those depths is normal for them. If you can see up at the middle here, that rectangle, that cube is SeaWorld. All right, and that is what we give up to 10 orcas to live in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's just one dive. And he does that multiple times and moves horizontally while he's moving vertically. And so given that that's all we give them in captivity, you can see sort of where the problem is. Social groupings, very, very different for these extremely social animals. Some of them are solitary, like polar bears, but most of them are very social. This is a sea otter enclosure, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's the sea otter. Remember the picture I showed you? There was a raft of sea otters out in the wild. A raft is, I don't know, 100 sea otters holding hands, and they are basking in the sun or they're cleaning themselves. And that's what we give them in a zoo. So you can see that there's a problem there. Environmental quality and complexity. Again, these are sentient animals, they're intelligent animals, they're social animals, and we pretty much give them a box, right? So this is a polar bear exhibit in China, which is unfortunately a growing, expanding industry. Everywhere else, the industry is kind of shrinking. This entertainment, zoo, and aquarium industry for marine mammals is kind of shrinking. It's called the blackfish effect, if you think about that. So for the last 10 years, it's been contracting, which is yay. But in China, it's expanding, which is no yay. Okay, so we've got like 30 or 40 were in existence in 2015, and now it's over 90 in just the last 8 years, tripling the number of industry facilities. These two polar bears, first of all, you remember what I just said? Polar bears are solitary. We tend to put them together. They don't really like that very much. And it's a hotel. Okay. China's really keen on that sort of thing. They put them in hotels, shopping malls. And I really don't get the shopping mall thing because the tanks are on like the 5th floor. And if they ever go through the floor, because it's a lot of water, everybody's in big trouble. But anyway, these two polar bears are on display all the time to people who are sleeping there and in hotel. And it's just concrete and nothing much. So again, these are Arctic animals that travel amazing distances, and this is all we can give them in captivity. Behavioral restrictions. Again, complex, intelligent, social mammals. Killer whales are killer whales. Yeah. We call them orcas, and that's great, but they were called killer whales for a reason. The one on the left is killing a sea otter pup. A sea lion pup. Got to eat to survive. The one on the right is killing a Dahl's porpoise. They ram, they bite, they shake. This is how they killed the trainer, by the way. Tillicum killed his trainer by doing all three of those things: ramming, biting, and shaking her. And this is what we do in captivity. We just drop dead fish into their mouth. Okay. They don't get to exercise that incredibly sophisticated and complex part of their behavioral repertoire. It's boring for these animals in captivity. And especially when I'm talking to children, they really grok that. Boring is no fun for a kid, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing is that boring leads to depression. Depression can kill. All right. These animals are not doing well in captivity. Even if it's only because they're bored, it's also because they're not active. It's also because they can't, they're not given a very diverse diet. There's a lot of other physical reasons why they're not doing well. But even if it was only because they were bored, that's not as minor as it sounds. It's huge, actually. They do self-harming behavior. All right. And that's probably the most significant thing that you can see in a species of wildlife held in a zoo or an aquarium to show that they're not doing very well. That's normal teeth. This is a dead animal found stranded on the beach, but normal teeth. That's one of the reasons they're scary. They've got these big conical shaped teeth that can rip and tear. This is what they do to them in captivity. All right. This is Tilikum, the whale that killed his trainer. And even without any teeth, he did some real damage. But they literally crib. You know, if you're a horse person, you know what that means. They just grind their teeth on the walls of their tank until they wear them down to the gum line. They're open, just like our teeth would be, cavities. You can't put amalgam into a killer whale's tooth. They're just going to rinse it right out as soon as they dive. And so they have to stay open. They have to constantly be disinfected. And even so, I think it's actually one of the reasons they live shorter lives in captivity. Their teeth are so bad. Bad teeth leads to bad health in every mammal I can think of. So what are the alternatives for the animals? Seaside sanctuaries. We're working very hard on the concept, but it is at the moment pretty much only a concept because it's not the same as building a sanctuary for an elephant. This is the paw sanctuary, you know, or a tiger or a bear. There are lots of successful business models, if you will, out there, operational around the world. In China, there's a wonderful bear sanctuary. In California, there's paw sanctuary, big cat sanctuaries. All of them work on land. You can buy the land and you can build, you know, enclosures that are so big the animals can get around and do things, not be bored, etc. For a marine sanctuary, you can't buy water. You can't buy the ocean. It's owned by the government or owned by, you know, all governments on the high seas. You can't buy a plot of ocean. So you have to get permissions to use that bit of ocean, and that's not easy. Okay, so all of these things are tricky. Iceland has agreed to allow a particular bay. It was used by Keiko, and now it's being used by two belugas. I can't get, well, I guess I can. Ooh. Used by Keiko, but also now being used by two belugas who were kept in China. And the company that bought that facility in China decided to close it for its belugas. It didn't want the belugas. It just wanted the rides and all of that. And so they retired them. They didn't just sell them to another facility. And that was a huge step forward. They retired them to this bay in Iceland. They're paying for this. I mean, they've invested in this. It makes them look good. You know, they're an aquarium theme park runner, but hey, they put their belugas in a sanctuary. I think that's actually really a good business decision. You're heroes now. Okay. And so the problem with this particular sanctuary is Iceland's a really rough place for humans to be in the winter. Icelanders drink a lot. And I'm not just saying that, they really do. I've seen them do it. So they need to move these animals into a land-based facility every winter. They're trying to move past that. Keiko stayed out. He didn't get moved onto land every winter. He stayed out in the bay, and they're trying to move to that point, but they dismantled, they being, you know, my organization, actually. We dismantled everything after Keiko left here. And so the facilities we had that allowed them to stay out on the water are gone. And so they have to reconstruct those. So they're getting there. And eventually, hopefully, they'll find a good crew of folks who don't mind being in 24-hour darkness and huge storms during the winter. And then the two belugas can stay out there. It doesn't bother the belugas. It's the team. It's the caretaking team that has the problem. This is the Whale Sanctuary Project in Nova Scotia. We are building a cold water cetacean sanctuary here. It can hold, these little white dots are belugas. We're hoping to hold as many as 8 of those, or perhaps orcas. There really aren't going to be 8 orcas that anybody's going to give us, but we can probably find 8 belugas that somebody will give us. We're working on belugas that are being held in Taiwan. We're working on belugas that are being held in Korea. Notice I don't say North America because, again, they're holding on to these animals very tightly. But if we can show proof of concept with this facility in Nova Scotia, this is 100 acres, by the way, way, way bigger than any seaquarium or facility on land. There will be a quarantine facility on land, so the animals will be quarantined for a couple of months every time they arrive to make sure they're not carrying any contagious diseases, but then they'll go out. There will be a walkway all the way around where this net is so that the team can go out on land without a boat and, you know, keep the animals in, their line of sight, even out in the remotest corner, which is out here. And the entire community is behind this. So they're really keen on being the first North American beluga sanctuary. So that's a key part too. This is true for land sanctuaries as well. And then the National Aquarium of Baltimore, a dolphinarium, an industry facility, has decided to retire its dolphins. They have 6 now, I think. And so this is sort of their proof of concept. Again, this is an artist's rendition. This isn't what it's going to look like. This will be what our sanctuary looks like. This is probably not what the National Aquarium Sanctuary is going to look like, but this is probably going to be in Puerto Rico. That is where they've been really focused on for quite some time. And, as you can see, the only way you can view these animals is from a distance. This isn't for you. This isn't for us. This isn't for entertainment. It's for the animals. And so that brings me to sort of what the future might hold. We have to end their breeding. Can't make any more that need care. I mean, they can't be released if they're born in captivity. And I say that with a little bit of reticence now. I don't really know what we'll know in 10, 15, 20 years. But right now, we're really crappy orcas, and we can't train orcas who've been born in captivity to be wild orcas. We don't know what they need to know. We don't know what they need to know socially. We don't know what they need to know in terms of their behavioral repertoire. And they don't know because they were born in a box. And their mothers were captured when they were 3. And they just don't know enough. So at the moment, we don't think they can be released. But some of the wild caught whales and dolphins, seals and sea lions could probably be released if they remember enough. But nevertheless, we need to stop making more of them. We need to end the captures. This is one of the zoo and aquarium animals in the world that is still very frequently captured from the wild. And so then we also need to end the live trade. We're never going to build enough sanctuaries for the 3,000 whales and dolphins, let alone all the pinnipeds and all of the, manatees and so on that are in captivity. So we need to work on improving their welfare in the boxes they're in, because the fact is that most of them are going to stay there. Sanctuaries where possible and release where possible. So that's the future for them. And also, Kathy noted, robotic, dolphins. I saw that robotic dolphin, and it is really eerie. I couldn't tell the difference from just what I was watching. And so CGI, animatronics, IMAX, some of these immersive, like sort of right whale, you put a GoPro on the right whale. Wow, is that cool? Because they take the GoPro down with them and then it just falls off later, right? Some of that footage is amazing. So, we can do a lot of things, especially for children. They do need to learn about these animals. And so we can do things that they're going to think is a lot more cool than just seeing some live animal in a box jumping around. Touching a screen and making it do something, bells and whistles, they're much more, that's the generation that we need to reach. And that they're much more into that sort of, immersive virtual reality, holographic, et cetera, sort of thing. And I think that's the future for us in terms of being entertained by these animals. And I did want to say about Toki, if anybody's got any questions, I'll do my best to answer, but that's a tough nut to crack. It's not as great news as it sounds, although it's pretty good news, All right, so thank you very much.
Alrighty. Well, we're moving into the in-person Q&A. Laura will be feeding some virtual questions, and I'll be handling any in-person questions. So does anybody have any questions to ask? Yes.
Okay, great. Max Barad, DC Village for Animals. Thank you all for amazing presentations. I'll just on topic, I'll share. I was reading an article in Vox yesterday about how pescatarians are responsible for more harm to animals than the average meat eater, which is very poignant. I'm curious, I'm looking at policy, and I'm curious to hear, I know Ms. Krebs from PCRM spoke about policy initiatives. I'm curious to hear about more policy initiatives that folks think could be used to protect aquatic animals and advance alternatives. I have an interest on a local level, but curious to hear, local or national.
Just for marine mammals, the 2 major statutes that are in play in the wild side are the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And we are trying to improve protections for captive marine mammals under the MMPA. The ESA really isn't in play for captive marine mammals. Very few of them are listed. which is actually an interesting point, that very few endangered species are actually in zoos and aquariums as marine mammals. The other statute that's obviously in play, and it's true for some of the species we're talking about here, is the Animal Welfare Act. And again, we are working very hard on getting the marine mammal regulations updated. They are grossly outdated. They were last updated, the ones that we're talking about, space, water quality, and so forth, in 1984. And I have to tell you, the science as a field biologist before I became a policy person, it has moved forward, exponentially. And so the idea that they're still working with 1984 regs when we know so much more about them now and what they need is ludicrous. So we're working very hard on that. We've been working with Congress on trying to push the regulatory agency, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, to do something, to do anything at this point. And so, yeah, we're working on regulation and some legislative initiatives.
Hi, Francisca Shun, Mercy for Animals. I'm curious about what you were just mentioning. So what are the implications for Lolita being removed from SeaWorld?
What are the plans?
Yeah, like do you have any idea of what's going to happen?
She's not at SeaWorld. She's at the Miami Seaquarium, which is a very old-fashioned, for what I just said, the regulations are way outdated, and that was built 30 years before those regulations. So she's actually not covered under the Marine Mammal Protection Act because she's pre-act. She was caught in 1970, and the MMPA was passed in 1972. That's how long she's been in that box, 53 years. The fact that she's still alive is actually a testament to her. She's a tough old broad, is how I put it. She did have a companion who was another orchid. He died, many, many years ago. So she persists. I don't really know why. I really don't actually know why. She must be kind of off. It's such a tiny tank. Anyway, plans for removing her. Not part of that, sort of behind the scenes conversation. But I can tell you this, she's covered by the ESA, not the MMPA, but the Endangered Species Act. She was listed when her population, the southern resident killer whales, were listed a few years later, but she's listed with them. And so there are going to be some hurdles to clear to move her to the Pacific Northwest, where she's from. I don't think they're insurmountable hurdles, but they're big. Building an enclosure for her there would be Clean Water Act, Coastal Zone Management Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, blah, blah, blah. So they're going to need permits from the Army Corps of Engineers and so on. And then, moving her logistically is just going to be a challenge. She is 57 years old. We've never moved a 57-year-old orca before. I don't know. So I don't really know. I mean, the big news is that the owners of this animal, as Kathy pointed out, their property, somebody owns them. The owner of this animal has finally agreed, because it's a new owner. They just bought the place last year. They're agreeing to let her go. Nobody who owned her before, since 1970, was ever going to let her go. They were just like, no, get out of my office. I don't want to talk to you. Whenever anybody went in there with a plan. And now for the first time, the owners have actually said, you tell us where to send her and she's gone. They don't want her. It's a business decision from their standpoint, but I don't care. They don't want her. Great. So if we can get our act together and come up with a place to send her, they will let her go. That's the big news.
Any other questions? Yes.
So along those lines, with Michael with DCB, the manatees. So once they're in captivity, they cannot be released.
Manatees are a different story. They're vegetarians already. Okay, so the manatee is our vegan, patriot. They're the only herbivorous marine mammal. And because of that, they can be released if they've been brought into captivity, rehabilitated from a ship strike or some sort of injury, and they are competent. They can be released because they're just cows. They literally call it sea cows, and they graze. They don't have to have like sophisticated foraging techniques or anything like that. And so they have been released. Sometimes, I think a couple that were born in captivity have been successfully released, but certainly a lot of injured animals that were brought in for rehabilitation have been returned to the wild. So actually, most of the manatees, I would say 99% of the manatees you see in captivity in North America were unreleasable. They were so badly injured, they just couldn't be returned to the wild. All the rest have gone back. So manatees are a different story.
So those ones that were injured are the ones that you're talking about that would be in those larger enclosures? Like
So
Iceland,
you mean so those are all whales and dolphins.
We have a virtual question. Mark Silverman is wondering if any of you know of an organization which assists with relocating sharks from a research lab into the ocean, or if that's possible.
That's a really good question. A really good question. I think it's possible because no offense to sharks, but they got a brain the size of a walnut, and everything they do is instinctive. Like, you know, you put a fish in front of a shark and it's going to know what to do. Whereas I'm not sure Keiko didn't know what to do. He looked at a fish and he was like, toy. And he played with it. He didn't eat it and he didn't kill it. It was really strange. Anyway, I think you can return sharks. If anybody's done it, I don't know. They usually end up dead. So, yeah, I think you could.
Then there are talks at a lot of farm transition support programs, not actual support programs out there. And as costs and not as much guarantee, obviously, to the actual care as opposed to farm, which have that plan, which we actually.
Yeah, it's definitely harder with fishing. I think more of the programs are just geared towards sort of providing people with new careers, providing people with jobs that are less visibly risky. That's at least in the US. I'm not aware of international programs, but I would say something similar would probably work, especially, you know, in more like people that live in more vulnerable communities that are out there, you know, fishing and doing this for subsistence, like finding ways for them to maybe be instead participating in farming for the crops that go into plant-based products or something like that would probably be, you know, an easier transition. We certainly can't guarantee anything when it comes to dinner.
Another question.
Another version.
You know, I'm not even virtually, just from me. I was wondering, Dr. Krebs, why hasn't the NIH explored other options before this? Is it mostly political? Is it funding issues, or what is their motivation now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, they definitely have explored before, and like right now, I actually recently saw a graph of NIH funds going toward non-animal methods, and I think last year it was like 7% or something. So, and it's been steadily going up. So they already are, and they have been funding, you know, projects on things, you know, human-specific tissue chips. These are little devices that you can put in cultured human cells and grow them up into, you know, basically tissue that replicates in vivo human tissue, can model diseases, you can test drugs with them. And so they are funding projects like this. But, you know, the funding for animals vastly outnumbers that. And so I think that, you know, there's just been a lot of pressure from organizations, from the public to want to shift away from the use of animals. And in order to do that, they are going to have to invest in non-animal methods. And one of the things that really needs to be done in order to do that is to develop the methods, because in their eyes, they don't see the methods as fully being able to replace everything that you can do with an animal. So we're never going to be able to replace animals if we don't invest in other ways of experimenting. And then, I also mentioned like infrastructure. Another thing that would really help this transition away from animals is making these kinds of methods more accessible to researchers and having training programs for the next generation of scientists to know how to use these methods. It's slowly starting to happen. And I think it's really thanks to just a shift in public awareness and interest, but also, advocacy. I certainly don't want to take credit for it, but I've been, they sort of proposed this working group that I mentioned in my talk 2 years ago. And ever since then, I've been, every chance I get, writing like, you need to make this working group happen. We need to figure out how is the NIH going to invest in non-animal methods. So it's a really promising sign.
Thanks. Yes. Do you think that artificial intelligence can play a role in that? Like that GPT basically does everything now. Can't it animal models for us and things like that? Like, is it going to go that way, or is it going to be more like just?
Yeah, so there is a lot of things that we can do with computational biology and even toxicology. There are ways of modeling drug testing and safety testing, using existing data that we have, clinical data, experimental data, to, and the goal may not necessarily be to replace lab testing, but what it can do is, point you in a certain direction so that maybe you reduce the number of animals that have to be used, or, with human data, there's so much that we have now, like, the data that we get from the human genome, from these large consortia all over the world, genomic data, electronic health records, other kinds of clinical data. We can do computational experiments to figure out, different causes and risk factors for disease and pinpoint where, biological mechanisms that we might be able to target with drugs. So certainly, computation already does and probably will only continue to play a big role in medical advancements without using animals.
Virtual question. Ken Hopkins asks, can anyone talk about the recent decision in Washington state to not renew licenses for farming salmon and aquaculture? I'm sure the industry is challenging it in court, but I'm just wondering what may have led to that state's choice to end the practice.
One of the reasons I think is actually a marine mammal reason. The southern resident killer whales, which Toki Lolita is a member of, they're starving to death. And one of the reasons they're starving to death is there's no salmon. And salmon is a huge debate in Washington state. It's huge. And what to do with dams that damage spawning rivers, and how to restore spawning habitat. Culverts have damaged them, hydroelectric dams have damaged them. And then they don't actually necessarily limit recreational fishing, but they're, killing sea lions to prevent them from eating salmon. So salmon's a huge debate, a huge controversy. And I suspect that decision is related to that controversy. Farmed salmon are dangerous to wild salmon. They release pathogens. Their waste products go right into the ocean. It's not a good combination. A lot of diseases have been found in wild, free-ranging salmon as a result of farm salmon. The intense crowding inside the pens causes a lot of disease transfer. So I imagine there's a lot of controversy about aquaculture, salmon aquaculture in particular in that area, plus release, what do you call it? Hatchling releases, smolt releases, those are also very controversial because those fish aren't necessarily as good at finding their way home and that sort of thing. So we mess around a lot trying to fix what we broke, but we aren't very good at it.
I believe that comes to the end of our Q&A session.
So if you join me in thanking our wonderful panel.